Chapter 10, Force and Coercion, Part 3. One of the factors that will influence the use of force will certainly be how the officer approaches any interactions with citizens. Your book uses a typology, really a framework that was proposed by Sykes and Brent. They call this the three methods of regulation, but it's really describing three different kinds of interactions that police can have with citizens. So one is definitional, and so this is where the officer is merely asking questions, maybe making accusations that yes, you have committed the offense, you are guilty of drunk driving, you were speeding, whatever, or maybe the officer is coming onto a scene and trying to discern, is there anything that went wrong? You know, what's happening here? So this could just even be a general conversation, a friendly conversation. How's the weather? So this definitional interaction we would associate with very little force. This is where an officer is merely trying to ascertain what's happening, what's going on, or is making, again, the accusations. And that sounds maybe more severe than it is when we say make accusations. This is the officer that's is coming up and giving you the ticket, letting you know that you were speeding. But again, it could just be the officer wondering what's going on here, or having a general conversation. The imperative, we're going up to we're getting a little bit more forceful, and here it's more verbal commands. The imperative is when the officer is giving you orders. You will do this. You will vacate the premises. You will go home tonight, or else. Whatever it might be. Or you're getting arrested. Stand there. Halt. Police. Any of these kinds of things. This is more the imperative. So you can sense that in the verbal commands, they become more forceful. The definitional could be friendly. It could be, a little bit more professional, a little more confrontational in the definitional, but it's not to the level of the imperative where the officer is commanding people to do things. And then finally, we get to the coercive. This is where the officer actually threatens or actually uses force. And so, has the officer engaged in any kind of force, or is the officer threatening to engage in force? Has the officer drawn his or her weapon? Has the officer threatened to, arrest the person, or maybe is using physical force that actually is tackling the person, is putting the person in cuffs, those kinds of things? That would be more coercive. So, of the three interactions with the citizens, this would be the most confrontational, the coercive. We already talked about this. This is kind of just a reminder from the last slide, but I just wanted to point out the different levels that your textbook mentioned, that the use of force continuum levels. Again, the officer can go from, in these interactions, can go from mere presence to verbalization to command. So now we're getting more into the imperative that we just saw in the last slide. So the command voice, to now we start getting into the more coercive, which is the application of firm grips, maybe then to pain compliance. So this is a slightly different continuum and different levels than we saw with our images that we had from the previous PowerPoint presentations. But here now maybe we start to apply pain compliance. So those are those pressure points, the wrist locks, those kinds of things. We start to maybe use impact techniques, so strikes to the body, but not deadly strikes, all the way up to deadly force. And so you've already seen these, so I'm not going to spend much more time on it. It's more of a reminder, and I just wanted to mention the different levels that your book includes. So we can go from mere presence, which is the lowest level of force, all the way up to deadly force, which is the most severe, the highest level. So we said in the last PowerPoint presentation, we don't know a lot about, is force increasing, is it decreasing? But if we use whatever data is available to say, well, it's decreasing. If that's the case, then why? And so I'm not saying that it is true that use of force by the police is decreasing, but if we were to believe that it is, if for the sake of argument we accept that it is decreasing, what are some of the reasons that today it has decreased versus 10 years ago or 20 years ago? Well, one key factor might be more restrictive laws and policies. So we saw this with Tennessee versus Garner. If we have fewer bullets flying downrange, that's probably better for everybody. If you think of the old classic Christmas movie, It's a Wonderful Life, Jimmy Stewart tries to run away from his friend Bert the cop, but when he comes back to Bedford Falls after Clarence has said you no longer exist, and so it's that part of the film where George Bailey doesn't exist. Well, Bert isn't his friend, and he thinks George Bailey is crazy, maybe a criminal, and George Bailey takes off running down the street, and Bert the cop starts firing shots at him as innocent bystanders and pedestrians just start jumping out of the way. Well, that, as funny as that scene is, we'd be shaking our head and saying, oh my God, did police ever act that way? Yes, they did. So now that we have more restrictive laws and policies that closely govern not only deadly force but lower levels of force as well, we have Supreme Court decisions really laying out what the police can and can't do. We have departmental policies that really restrict the police. Initially, the police might view this as making their job more dangerous because we can't protect ourselves as quickly. The truth is, it's probably made their job safer. Right now, we have about we have under 100 officers a year who are killed by assaults in the line of duty. So we're not talking about accidents or other kinds of things, but actually killed by suspects. It's well under 100. That's still far too many. Okay, but it's much lower than it used to be. So we've learned, and part of the responsibility is we've made the police be more restrictive in how they use force. Because if you think about it, if there's a suspect who otherwise would have given up freely, if you start firing shots at that suspect, their survival instinct might kick in, and they might not have otherwise fired shots back, but now they do. And so suddenly you're involved in a gun battle that you might not have needed to be involved in if you had just followed the law yourself as a police officer. So restrictive laws and policies may be a reason for less frequent use of force. Better training. Okay, we're teaching officers how to better deal with situations. So how to use communications, how to control, how to identify trouble before it happens, how to diffuse it before it becomes problematic, how to deal with, whether we're talking about an individual suspect or an entire mob, how do we deal with it? And so better training. More force options that are less than lethal available to police officers. So, a taser, a pepper spray, these kinds of things now give police more options than they had in the past, where maybe they only had their nightstick and their revolver. Now they have better options available that are less than lethal. And so that may be a reason for less frequent use of force. So when they do use force, it's not just maybe we have a use of force incident, but it's not a deadly force incident. It's a lower level force incident where 30 years ago it might have been a deadly force situation. More oversight, both official and unofficial. What I mean by unofficial is, as we've said in previous PowerPoint discussions, everybody has a smartphone these days. You might as well just assume if you're a police officer you're going to be recorded in whatever you're doing, even when you're not. Just act as if you are. And so that may make you reconsider whether you're going to use force in a situation or not. How am I going to look on video? Am I going to be justified? Maybe you have doubts whether you're justified in using force. So you err on the side of caution and you don't use force. So oversight, unofficial oversight, but also more official oversight. We have more body cams. We have more cruiser cams. We have street cameras that will capture things. And so with all this oversight, there's more control over police officers. And so if they believe that they're being watched, they may behave more professionally and be less inclined to use force when it's not justified. Better protection. We may have had situations in the past that would have been more immediately deadly force situations, but now because that officer has a Kevlar vest, maybe they're more protected. Maybe it doesn't turn into a deadly force situation, although if somebody shoots at you, obviously that's deadly force, and you would be entitled to fire back. But, in other situations, if somebody takes a swing at you, that Kevlar vest should protect you some. If someone takes a punch at you, all these kinds of things, you're less likely to be harmed. So better protection for those officers. This goes also along with better training, so better self-defense techniques, all these kinds of things. Better educated officers. So we hope that if we're attracting better educated officers, they're going to have better communication skills. And what we find is something that people may not believe is true, but it actually is, that police tend to use less force than they're entitled to use to resolve a situation. than less force than they might be entitled to use under the law. So police are figuring out other ways to resolve situations than by using force. So even if the law would fully justify them in using force in a situation, the experienced police officer, the educated police officer may have discovered ways to deal with the situation just with verbal commands. And so even though the suspect might be threatening them in some way, the officers are confident enough that they can handle the situation merely with verbal commands, that they don't need to resort to force. And so even though the law would justify them, we often find that police officers use less force than they're actually justified in using, and they still accomplish the job. They still get the job done. So part of that could be the reaction to better educated officers. We have officers who are better trained in understanding communities and understanding people and also communicating. On the other hand, because we don't know the frequency of use of force, it's possible that it could be increasing. We may be having more force situations out in the streets. And so what might be causing that? Well, one key factor can certainly be the militarization of the police. So you had a Canvas video that deals with this. So there was a federal program that started in the 1990s that gave surplus military equipment like armored personnel carriers and other kind of equipment to the police. And so we've seen a trend in many police departments across the United States towards increasing militarization. The first SWAT teams were created back in the 1970s. But now practically every police department of any decent size has a SWAT team, a tactical team. Is it really necessary? Okay, that's one of the questions we have to ask. Is militarization leading to more use of force against the police? So for instance, police, when you have those armored personnel carriers and you have automatic weapons and you have battle gear, even if you're in a city where nothing ever really happens to justify it, there's kind of a tendency to say, hey, we've got all this fun stuff, why don't we use it? And so they're overusing the tactical team. They're overusing, maybe it's not even a tactical team, it's ordinary police officers, but they like to dress up like soldiers because it's fun. It's fun to crash through somebody's window and serve a no-knock warrant. But in the old days, and this isn't coming from some extreme left-wingers who hate the police, this is coming from former police officers, many of them will say, in the old days, we served our warrants by knocking on the door, identifying ourselves as police, and invariably, in 99.9% of the cases, the person would come to the door. It wasn't like you had Scarface behind the door saying, hollering out, say hello to my little friend, and getting his machine gun and blasting the door. In 99.9% of the situations, the suspect wants to live through the day, and so they're going to give up. And these are police officers who are saying that. They said, we never needed to crash through the windows. We never needed to do these no-knock arrests. We could just knock on the door and they would come to it. But you see more and more every year of these no-knock warrants, these no-knock arrests where the police are crashing through windows. They're throwing flashbang grenades to disorient people inside. And the people inside don't know what's happening. They're not instantly, they're waking up from a deep sleep. Suddenly there are people crashing through their windows. There are grenades going off that are, with a blast of light and sound that disorients them. They don't know what's happening. And some of them are reaching for guns and they're getting shot. Or maybe they're reaching their gun and they're shooting police officers. These are not good tactics. And again, I'm not saying this as some left-winger who hates the police. I'm saying this as, listening to former police officers who say, why do we need all of this? We don't need people crashing through windows. And what's worse, it's bad enough, but what makes it even worse is sometimes the police get the wrong addresses. And they crash through an innocent family's windows. And sometimes even those innocent people get killed. Or the first casualty in these no-knock arrests are usually the family pets. It is pretty common to shoot the family pet, the family dog, whatever it might be. And so, again, we need to study this more. We don't know the exact numbers. We don't know the nature of these no-knock arrests, these kinds of things. But this militarization of the police is something that a lot of police veterans are saying is not a a good trend. And the federal government has cut off a lot of these programs so that we're not continuing to give police these armored personnel carriers and other things. Do the big cities need them? Probably. Do state police departments need them? So yeah, if there's a situation, but does state college need an armored personnel carrier? No. Okay, we can bring in the state police if that's not really necessary. But the militarization of police is a concern. The Dutch police have talked to me about this. And so they have talked to me about their riot police, and they've found that if you have this militarized presence, and maybe it's at a protest that has the potential to turn violent, if the police come to it in full battle gear, full riot gear, I should say, not battle gear, but full riot gear, that heightens the tensions. You have just increased the likelihood for violence instead of diminishing it. And so what the Dutch police do is, and I've actually observed this, I happened to be walking through Amsterdam and there was a pro-Israeli and an anti-Israeli protest going on in the main square. And I happened to walk past that rally and I got to a side street, and that's where the tactical team was, the riot police were. And that's what the Amsterdam police do now. They don't have the tactical team on site. They don't have the riot police on site right there at the protest. Because people will start looking around saying, holy crap, if the riot police are here, they must have heard something. The other side is really going to get into violence, so we better be prepared for violence. And meanwhile, the other side is saying the exact same thing, so everybody's tension is going up. So instead, the Amsterdam police keep their tactical team out of sight, but at a close distance. So if they need to be there quickly, they can. But they're not on the scene heightening tensions. So again, if we're using force more frequently, maybe it's because of the increased militarization of the police. Could also be because maybe we need to use more force. Maybe citizens are in possession of more dangerous weapons. Certainly criminals have had automatic weapons. We can go back to the machine guns during Prohibition that the gangsters had, that Al Capone's gang had, that, Lucky Luciano's gang had, and all the others. But, we have not just organized criminals who have automatic weapons, but we have others who have it. They have cop killer bullets that can pierce body armor. So maybe the police do need to use more force, maybe because the public has become more dangerous. So it's not just that the police are increasing their use of force, it's also the public is engaging in more, is challenging the police more, is engaging in more uses of force, all the way from lower levels of force all the way up to deadly force. This can go along with something known as perceived danger. Do the police perceive that the danger is greater out on the streets? Do the police think that policing is more dangerous today than it used to be 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago? Well, if they're entering every shift worried about whether they're going to survive that shift, then we could expect that they're going to be a little quicker on the trigger, a little quicker on the trigger than they would be if they had, a more or less dangerous relationship with the public. So the Dutch police, going back to them, guns are strictly regulated in the Netherlands, and there are still guns on the streets, but it's really uncommon for a police officer to be shot by anyone. I mean, for the entire country, the number of police officers who have been shot by a suspect, it's probably about one every several years. Not one a year, but every several years some police officer is killed by being shot. So the Dutch police are dealing with a society that has a very low level of violence, very low level of gun violence, pretty much good respect and good relationships with the police. So the Dutch police don't have that, and Dutch police have even told me this. So again, it's not my own observation, it comes from Dutch police. They say when we visited American police officers, their tension was higher than ours. When they went out on their shift, they were more concerned about surviving that shift than we ever are. That doesn't mean to let down your guard, but that means we need to take a look at this perceived danger. Does it really match the actual danger? Should the police have this heightened level of tension, or is policing safer than we think? And so again, that's not telling police to overlook any kind of danger, but it is saying maybe they don't need to be as concerned as they are. They still need to be alert, they still need to be attentive, they still need to be cautious. But should they be suspicious of every single situation? Can we train them to have a more rational fear? So if their perceived danger is too high, that means some of it's irrational. It's unjustified. Can we train them to spot those indications of danger much better? And my friend who's in the FBI, who's the communications analyst, would say, yes, we can. We can teach you to spot the signs of danger, not 100% of the time, but much better than you can right now. And if we can do that, that can now direct your attention and your fear towards those situations where it's justified. Better than those situations where maybe this is someone who is unarmed, they make a quick move, but really they're not showing any other signs of aggression. And maybe the police officers are able to quickly assess that and realize this person is not a threat versus the person who really is a threat. Now that requires a lot of training, but it is possible. And so if we don't give that training, if the police officers every year are thinking their job is more dangerous and they're more of a target, then it's likely that they're going to be quicker to use force because they're going to perceive a threat quicker than they would otherwise. And again, we have to take a look at whether this is reasonable or unreasonable.